Hi, Janessa. This is your first live, right? Oh, are we live? Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this vital Q&A session. We open tonight's event at a sobering moment in global affairs as we approach the 60-day mark of the conflict in Iran. The stakes of our discussion have never been higher. What began as a crisis in late February has fundamentally shifted the landscape of international security, reminding us that the theories of nonproliferation we study are, in fact, the thin line between peace and devastating escalation. Your questions tonight are essential. Whether you're looking for clarity on the recent headlines or want to dive into the technicalities of regional security, this floor is yours. Thank you for joining us. Al, go ahead.
Faceted impacts of the current conflict in the Middle East, moving beyond the headlines to look at the economic, personal, and systematic realities affecting our military communities. We have a panel of experts here to ground this conversation in both data and lived experience. Let's start with the hard numbers. Libby, what is the current picture?
Thanks, Al. To understand the gravity of the situation, we have to first look at resource allocation. As of April 2026, the conflict has resulted in a total estimated cost of approximately $33 billion. And we've seen a significant shift in this operational tempo. So starting in the initial phases, which we're categorizing as February 28th to March 5th, the daily burn rate was roughly 2.1 billion per day, and this was driven by heavy missile salvos. And the current phase, now in April, we've seen it decrease to 350 to 650 million per day following the recent fragile ceasefire. However, the military has already burned through over 850 Tomahawk cruise missiles and 1,000 air defense interceptors. And when we look at how this impacts military families specifically, this data is sobering. So we're seeing that 30% of families are reporting food insecurity. 51% of enlisted families specifically are saying that they're just getting by. Another 67% are facing childcare wait lists, and 21% are experiencing disruptive mental health access. And we wanted to pull this back a little bit and look at the bigger picture. While we are focusing on the Iran conflict as it's current today, we also wanted to give you a bit more insight into how budgeting and money is being used across the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, and specifically how it's being used towards nuclear forces. So we pulled some numbers, and in 2026, the DoD budget is $838.5 billion, growing to $1.5 trillion in 2027. And military family support funding makes up only 1.2% of this total budget, whereas nuclear forces funding makes up 11% of the overall budget. And in 2026, the Department of Energy's budget was $46.3 billion, growing to $53.9 billion in 2027. And the reason we're focusing on Department of Energy here is because they're handling nuclear waste management. And that's done through their Office of Environmental Management. And through this office and that overall Department of Energy budget, only 1.85% of it is going towards nuclear waste. So taking a look at those numbers, you can see how military family support funding and also nuclear waste management isn't a priority in the overall scheme of the thousands and billions of dollars that are being given to Department of Defense and Department of Energy.
Libby, those numbers perfectly represent the questions we're hearing here at the ground as Secure Families Initiative. Families are feeling the friction between national security spending and their own household stability. Additionally, Secure Families Initiative has more resources available in the Readiness Toolkit, where you can find more information regarding any specific needs you may have. Furthermore, there's some additional nonprofit groups specializing in supporting military families when unexpected costs arise. This includes the Army Emergency Relief, which offers emergency financial help for active duty retirees and families, the Navy Marine Corps Relief Society, providing financial assistance, interest-free loans, and grants to active duty and retired Navy and Marine Corps families. The Air Force Aid Society supports Air Force families with emergency aid, scholarships, and community programs and the Coast Guard Mutual Assistance, which offers free loans or interest-free loans, grants, and counseling for Coast Guard members and their families.
Jet, thank you for mentioning those resources. They're so important, especially now. The Army's decision to extend the reenlistment window to 2 years for those deployed in support of this war has created immense anxiety about long-term planning. Families are asking, will my service member be stop-lost? And with carrier groups like the USS Abraham Lincoln and the USS Gerald R. Ford in the region, they are wondering if the traditional 6 to 9 month deployment cycles are being abandoned for indefinite stays.
Exactly, and there's a real fear regarding the next phase. With the recent buildup of 50,000 troops, families want to know if we're heading towards a large-scale ground invasion. They're looking at the $33 billion spent and asking, why is there more money for munitions, but not for my child's school lunch?
Yes, exactly. The contrast is impossible to ignore, especially when you look at the 1,068% increase in Tomahawk procurement. But the financial strain is only part of it. The comms blackouts have been devastating in a very practical sense. Families are struggling with basic administrative tasks like paying bills or changing phone plans because their power of attorney isn't being recognized while their spouse is unreachable. And the number of wounded in action numbers currently approach 400. Families deserve transparency about safety, care, and what's happening at Oconus bases. One question we hear from families again and again is, how do I manage the household with zero communication? That's not just frustration, that's a crisis of basic functioning. The frequency of blackouts during the Iranian retaliatory strikes has made this urgent. And SFI's toolkit has concrete resources to help families navigate that exactly.
Service member from retiring from active duty when there's an ongoing crisis. So if a person had already put in his or her papers to retire, that process would be held up until the crisis was over. And we don't know when this crisis will be over. It is clear that the why of this conflict is also weighing heavily on families. Are we aiming for a regime change, nuclear nonproliferation, or regional deterrence? And after the April 7th ceasefire, everyone is wondering whether this is a real pause or just the eye of the storm. Families are asking to what degree the US government would go to force Iran to surrender. Would nuclear weapons be considered? Nixon tried the madman theory, in which he threatened the use of nuclear weapons against North Vietnam to force them to surrender. It didn't work then. Recently, I wrote a short blog on the SFI webpage about the difficulties in getting Iran to release its highly enriched uranium as a show of good faith that it is not engaged in a nuclear weapons program. By far, the preferable approach is a diplomatic negotiation as opposed to a large-scale invasion of Iran that could cost thousands of lives and cause mass destruction. There's no sudden timeline that demands prompt military action, and we ought to approach this crisis with cool heads. Shalena, how does this aspect of nuclear nonproliferation fit into the broader landscape for marginalized communities?
Thank you all for all that. And I also just want to reiterate, if you're joining us live and you have a question, please go ahead and enter that in the chat. We are answering live questions, and if you would like more information on our nuclear nonproliferation leadership team or have questions, you want to shoot us an email, please visit us at securefamiliesinitiative.org. And it's vital to recognize that the burden of nuclear policy is not shared equally. We have to address how indigenous lands and Black communities have been disproportionately targeted for uranium mining and nuclear testing, such as the downwinders in the American Southwest or French testing in the French Polynesia and Algeria. This is part of a nuclear dominance framework that has historically sidelined the voices of the global South. When we discuss policy, we have to ask, how can we make non-proliferation advocacy more inclusive for military families who bear the direct burden of these tensions? What barriers are preventing leaders from underrepresented backgrounds from entering high-level nuclear policy negotiations? How does this current funding for nuclear modernization directly drain the budget for social safety nets and low-income communities? We need to prioritize human security using storytelling and personal narratives like those of Habakusha and Rika claimants is essential to making this data impactful and ensuring local organizers have a seat at the table for treaty renewals and any other um, discussions that involves nuclear nonproliferation.
Yeah, to add to Shalina's point, we also need to look at the physical environmental risks. We're moving nuclear materials across the country, often through or near major military hubs, and we need better safety protocols and environmental impact assessments for these transports. Heightened concerns about recent loosening of nuclear regulations for both energy and waste include safety rule changes. Basically, the Department of Energy removed the as low as reasonably achievable ALARA principle, which required operators to keep radiation exposure low as possible. This could allow for less shielding in reactors and longer work shifts. Secondly, security reductions. Safety and security rules for new reactors were rewritten, reducing requirements for security guard training and physical barriers, turning detailed specifications into broad bullet points. Third, environmental exemptions. The DOE established a categorical exclusion allowing experimental nuclear reactors to bypass certain environmental reviews. Fourth, goals of changes. These actions, driven by executive orders, are meant to accelerate the development of advanced nuclear reactors and basically nuclear development. So they fall in line together. The energy sector and the defense sectors kind of fall in line with the same nuclear development, and they're working to meet aggressive timelines, such as having new designs operational by the 4th of July. And the concerns, critics, including experts from the Union of Concerned Scientists, argue that these changes, which were largely developed without public input, could increase risks of radiation exposure, weaken the security of radioactive materials, and hide the environmental impacts of new projects. Furthermore, we need transparency. Families deserve to know about minor radiological leaks or environmental accidents on base that don't reach the level of national emergency. Frankly, given that military families often have little choice in where they're stationed, we should be classifying them as a vulnerable population within our environmental justice frameworks. So, more questions include: should military families be classified as a vulnerable population in environmental justice frameworks, given that they often have little choice where they're stationed, as I mentioned, relative to toxic or radioactive sites? Now, in short, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission regulates civilian and commercial use of nuclear materials to ensure public health and safety. The Department of Energy promotes energy research and manages national security and weapons programs. So they're two distinct entities with different priorities. The core human risks in nuclear operations include radiation exposure. Workers, particularly in maintenance or decommissioning, risk receiving doses of radiation that, while usually within regulatory limits, can increase long-term cancer risk. Acute exposure though rare, can cause immediate radiation sickness. There's human error, both active and latent. Approximately 80 to 90% of events in high-tech industries are attributed to human error. These include active errors, direct mistakes by operators, and latent errors, systematic failures such as poor training or procedural errors that lie dormant. Now, there's also psychological and physical health that we need to be mindful of. Workers may face stress from high pressure environments or physical health issues arising from handling heavy, cumbersome equipment, especially in confined space or remote applications. Security threats, unauthorized access, or malevolent acts by humans. Insider threats pose risks of theft of material and sabotage. And I think additionally, the questions are many military families live in areas historically impacted by nuclear weapons development, especially people who are subject to environmental justice infringements. How do lingering radioactive isotopes like cesium-137 or strontium-90 in the soil and groundwater near historic testing sites or production facilities, for example, Hanford, Savannah River, or the Nevada testing site, continue to affect the health of families stationed nearby? Well, we know that approximately 56,000 military family members and support civilians across 5 U.S. bases are involved with various nuclear processes. This number does not include retired personnel. The National Council on Radiation Protection and Measurements has subsequently established the million-person study in the early 2000s to investigate the health effects of low-dose radiation. This is a significant effort to examine the historically subjective and vulnerable workforces to inform national policy regulations. Funding for such efforts are also subjective and are at risk of fluctuations to changes in national policy and priorities. Many studies to date have identified correlations to higher cancer and childhood leukemia risks, which manifest long after military duty assignments have changed. And furthermore, the U.S. National Spent Nuclear Fuel and High-Level Waste Management Policy, centered on the Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982, designates the federal government via the DOE, as Libby mentioned before, as responsible for disposing of commercial waste. And we're going to foresee much commercial waste in the future with the development of nuclear energy, and as we move forward in revitalizing our nuclear defense system. This waste typically housed in geological repositories. While the 1987 amendments specifically targeted Yucca Mountain, Nevada, for a permanent repository, political and legal impasse have shifted current strategy toward a consent-based approach to siting, with immediate reliance on on-site wet and dry storage or casks. Again, with this impasse, spent waste is extremely difficult and expensive to relocate, and subsequently ends up in situ on-site storage techniques, which are typically undesired by the neighboring public.
Thank you all. It is clear whether we're talking about multi-billion-dollar defense budgets, the stability of a military household, or the environmental safety of our communities, the human cost borne by military families is the common thread that we cannot afford to ignore. The nuclear defense budget in particular is significant and growing in the next year. While maintaining a nuclear deterrent is important, we need to remind the political leadership that the well-being of its military families are also important, and at a much smaller cost. Libby has some additional information about the nuclear deterrent costs in the current budget.
Yeah, thanks, Al. We've heard throughout this talk how these issues are affecting military families, marginalized communities, and the environment. And particularly being a military affiliated organization, we have a lot of strong experiential knowledge surrounding these topics. And that experiential data is powerful. And we wanted to back it up with some more numbers as well, so you can see how it's supported in the numbers alongside our own everyday experiences that we're seeing. So zooming out again, the Congressional Budgeting Office estimated about $94 billion a year will be spent on nuclear forces between 2025 and 2034. And this comes to a total for that 10-year period of $946 billion. And out of that exorbitant amount of money, it's broken down into 5 main categories. And the first one is to operate and sustain current and future nuclear forces. Gets $357 billion for that category. It's also focusing on modernizing strategic and tactical delivery systems for these nuclear forces, another $309 billion. It's also going to modernize these facilities and the equipment of the laboratories. That's $72 billion. It's going to modernize command, control, communication, and early warning systems, $79 billion for that category. And it's also got an additional separate category just to cover potential costs of going over budget. There's $179 billion just to cover that. And the interesting thing about this data is that the Congressional Budgeting Office justifies this by explaining that while in the past the focus has been on maintaining current nuclear weapon systems, this was considering the fact that nuclear forces have been featured less prominently in defense policy since the Cold War. However, many of these forces and these systems that they're using are reaching the end of their service lives. So they're anticipating a need that it might be necessary to modernize or even expand current nuclear forces. And in these current estimates, just to give you an idea, about 56% of the overall funding goes towards modernization. And the part that I really want to highlight is not only the sheer amount of money that's being dedicated to nuclear forces, but also that it's specifically being used for expansion. Meaning that while as we as military families are arguing against the use of these nuclear forces and working hard to bring awareness to the issues that they create for military service members, families, and the local Indigenous communities that are housed near our bases, the response we're seeing is instead to increase the exact thing that's causing these issues. And there are some additional caveats with this budget that I wanted to be sure to address. This $946 billion that I mentioned for that 10-year period does not account for costs that are indirectly associated for nuclear forces. And some of those things would be cleaning up former Department of Energy production facilities. It would be addressing nuclear legacy of the Cold War, so things like dismantling retired nukes and cleaning up environmental contamination. It also doesn't cover reducing threats of proliferation from other countries or developing and maintaining active defense against other countries' nuclear weapons. So while we're seeing huge amounts of money being designated for nuclear forces, none of this money covers the issues that we've discussed today on this live. And it also emphasizes that accountability for nuclear weapons is not viewed in parallel to their usage, in the sense that while having conversations about utilizing nuclear weaponry, the same weight isn't given to handling the impacts that these weapons will have. And you can see that in the numbers, just in the sense that the same amount of money isn't being designated. They're not even being handled by the same departments. And just to address a couple of pitfalls with this data, this information was gathered from the Congressional Budgeting Office. So it's not necessarily a determination by Congress of how this money will be allocated. It's just a study to inform Congress as to the long-term fiscal implications of nuclear modernization plans. And this estimate is updated every 2 years. And just to give you a little bit more insight, the previous years, we have been increasing during those 2-year estimates. So it is increasing in budget every time.
Thank you, Libby. That was a lot of information. And I just want to tell you all who are watching, our leadership team is closely working on finding the data, right, and extracting data and all those analytics to make sure that that's parallel to military families and the communities that they live in. And so thank you, Libby, for the breakdown. And ultimately, we must move away from the idea that nuclear policy is purely a technical or academic domain by bridging the gap between high-level negotiations and the lived experiences of marginalized survivors, like the Habakusha and Rika claimants, we can fundamentally reshape the impact of our nonproliferation data. Our advocacy must become truly inclusive, ensuring that local community organizers are not just consulted, but centered in critical discussions to ensure human security remains a priority. When we shift the focus to these human outcomes, we challenge nuclear power, the frameworks that have historically excluded underrepresented voices, and demand a more equitable path forward for everyone, especially those bearing the direct daily burden of these geopolitical decisions. And I want to thank you all for watching. And again, I would love to invite you all to be part of our nuclear nonproliferation leadership team. If you have questions, or if you simply just want more education on certain acronyms that are being used or that you're seeing in the headlines and you don't really understand it, we've built a community within the SFI organization to ensure that we are staying current to those headlines, but we're also educating each other and understanding how those impacts are for military families. So thank you for watching, and thank you for being a part of this.